You might have heard of the Me Too movement. What started off as a grassroots effort founded by American Tarana Burke, the Me Too movement has become an international social justice campaign to raise awareness around sexual harassment or assault and expose its perpetrators. It is a movement that aims to create a safe and supportive social environment for survivors and works towards disrupting the systems that allow sexual violence to proliferate. The Me Too movement gained considerable traction following a tweet by Alyssa Milano in 2017, which was retweeted more than 1 million times within just 48 hours. The movement quickly found its way into mainstream news, and since then, significant public awareness and public pressure has led to many high-profile men and people in positions of power to be held legally accountable for their actions. Businesses have also been forced to look inwards and reform their policies regarding harassment in the workplace. Now that we know a little bit more about the aims and history of the Me Too movement, we can look at this issue through the lens of some of the theories we have learned in this course so far. First, we will adopt conflict theory. In the case of the Me Too movement, the parties at conflict are the victims and offenders and the systems and social attitudes that perpetuate a culture where sexual harassment proliferates. Through a conflict theory lens, we could categorize those in positions of power who carry out sexual violence, who are often men, as the so-called dominant class, and the victims, who are often women, as the underclass. It is the offenders of sexual violence who take advantage of their power and force their victims, who are often in a position with much less authority than them, into a state of victimhood. In a Marxist fashion, some percentage of the movement believe that the only way forward to achieve true gender equality is to revolt and destroy the patriarchy. The patriarchy is a system of relationships, beliefs, and values embedded in political, social, and economic systems that structure gender inequality between men and women, whereby positions of dominance and privilege are held primarily by men. Feminist conflict theory holds that the structures and societal norms that allow sexual violence to proliferate are upheld by deeply ingrained patriarchal ideas of power and domination. The Me Too movement brought significant attention to the way that patriarchy affords men with the authority that positions them as the dominant class, at the same time that it positions women as the underclass. It sheds light on how these patriarchal ideas lead to sexual harassment and injustices which often see men protected from any serious accountability. The consequence of the patriarchy as the norm means that the victims who are in positions of lesser power and privilege than male perpetrators are ignored, silenced, disbelieved, or discouraged to come forward. Even if or when perpetrators are exposed, oftentimes justice is drawn out and requires many more than just one victim's voice for allegations to be taken seriously. This leads feminist conflict theorists to argue that the patriarchy must be destroyed everywhere it is present. Now, let's approach this issue from the position of critical theory. As we have explored in our previous lesson, conflict theory seeks to realize the fundamental freedom of human beings by critiquing power and domination wherever it may occur. Through a critical theory lens, we can identify that a large percentage of the Me Too movement seeks to end the injustice of sexual violence through the breaking down of patriarchal attitudes that are present in everyday life and by critiquing the policies of institutions, rather than an all-out revolt that conflict theorists argue for. The first concept of critical theory, reification, can be applied here. The Me Too movement seeks to bring light to the way that victims are reduced to a status of a sexual object. Not only does the offender reduce the victim to a status of a sexual object by committing violence against them, but unfortunately it is often the case that the victims will face criticism and judgment about what they were wearing, etc. when it happened, further stripping them of their personhood. Even in the case of news headlines and reportings, victims are often reduced to being identified only by where it took place or other external factors instead of their personhood. The second concept of critical theory, cultural hegemony, can also be applied here. The Me Too movement resists and challenges the cultural hegemony of the patriarchy. It challenges the system of patriarchal beliefs and values that are embedded in our political, social, and economic structures and institutions. It argues that these patriarchal systems have allowed toxic attitudes and sexual misconduct to be widely ignored or not taken seriously enough. The movement has made some progress in this space. For example, the public attention drawn to the Harvey Weinstein case meant that not only was the disgraced director sentenced to prison, but it also set off a new era in the global conversation around sexual violence and led to public policy changes, such as the banning of non-disclosure agreements in the case of sexual harassment in many US states. These attitudes and systems have remained in place for so long because they have benefited those who ultimately have the power to change them, whom are mostly men. People in power view these attitudes and institutions, which are deeply infused with the ideas of patriarchy, as the norm and unable to be changed, even though they are only socially constructed and therefore they can and must be reconstructed. The Me Too movement draws light on the way that patriarchal power is not strictly concentrated within politics, but is proliferated in all areas of life, including our culture, art, social institutions, and knowledge. The movement critiques and seeks to improve the production of knowledge by campaigning for better sexual consent education in schools and workplaces. For example, in 2022, new legislation was passed to incorporate comprehensive consent education, including an understanding of coercion, gendered stereotypes, and power imbalances in Australian school curriculum. This is a huge win for the Me Too movement in reforming the institutions that shape social attitudes and behaviours. To conclude, the Me Too movement has been pivotal in improving the conversation around sexual harassment and violence, leading to more accountability and institutional reform. However, there are some that argue that the movement has gone too far, but others who argue that it has not gone far enough. What do you think? Is it time to smash the patriarchy?